And welcome back to The Unscripted Show, a show where high school students work hard to achieve something larger than life. In this episode, we'll sit down with some successful teenagers who are paving their own way in our community. So with that, sit back, relax, and enjoy our show. Thank you.
Hi, welcome back to another episode of The Unscripted Show. I'm your host, Maahir Murad, and today we have two very inspirational guests. Our first guest is Rachel.
Hi.
And our second guest is Brooke.
Hello.
So if you guys could just take a second and tell us what you guys are doing, who you guys really are for the audience to know.
I'm Rachel. I'm a sophomore. This is my second year with the Bear Witness as a staff reporter. Next year, I'm going to be running for a spot on the editors. I'm going to hopefully be a managing editor next year like Brooke. And since my freshman year, I have won 6 awards for my articles from student newspapers online.
Wow. And Brooke?
My name's Brooke. I have been writing for the Bear Witness for about 2 years now. I'm currently one of the managing editors on the team, and this coming year, I'm going to be writing for editor-in-chief. It's just been really cool to be part of a team and learning about my passion for writing a lot. So I really enjoy newspaper and journalism in general.
So if you could take a second just to tell the audience what the Bear Witness is.
Oh, okay. The Bear Witness is the Cambridge High School's newspaper, and it's also just kind of the journalism outlet of the school that's mainly just based off of writing media rather than video media, though we do have some videos that you can get some of our journalism and news from. Like Rachel's done most of our videos for the school, or for our paper. So it's been kind of just based off of school events as well as national events. So we have covered Corona a little bit and some other stuff.
And so now let's get into it. So what made you want to write? What made you want to join this team?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. So I remember in 8th grade, so we had to sign up for what electives we wanted to take, right? And so in 8th grade, I was really passionate about art. I still love art, but I knew in high school I didn't want to pursue that. So I was like, okay, then what am I going to do? Then I'm looking at the list of all the electives and stuff, and I see newspaper. I'm like, you know what? That might be kind of interesting because I've always been a writer and I love writing. So I'm like, you know what? YOLO, let's do it. And I didn't really know why I wanted to join newspaper. I'm like, why am I attracted to this? Literally, I had never cared about news or reading a newspaper whatsoever. I could literally care less. But I'm like, you know what, let's just do it. I had this instinct. I just wanted to do it. And then so the first day freshman year when we walked into the the computer room where our class is, I just I started crying, not visually sobbing, but my eyes were welling up. I'm like, why am I crying right now? But I just knew this is where I was meant to be, and you could immediately
tears of joy.
Yeah, you could immediately sense this vibe of family and stuff. And Charisse and Libby, one of the editors, they're all smiling and stuff, and everyone just because the returning people are greeting each other, and then Libby's cracking jokes with Mr. Mcdermott and stuff. So yeah, it was really nice, and I was like, yes, this is where I need to be.
And what about you?
Personally, I was in film freshman year, just their level 1 class, and I realized I'm absolutely terrible with technology. I don't understand it. I don't like it. I can barely touch a computer except for writing a paper. So I was invited by Mr. Mcdermott, or not Mr. Mcdermott. He sent out flyers to a lot of literature classes about joining newspaper. And I got a letter, not specifically asking for me, but I think it was just Mr. Cleary gave it to kids who might be interested in it. And I thought it was really cool that I kind of had some incentive to go and figure out kind of what it was. And so Mr. Mcdermott had a small meeting with kids who might be interested in journalism. So it was my freshman year, and it was me and maybe 4 other kids in a room with the editors at the time, who were Daniel Greer Spradling and Charisse Kim. I don't know Daniel's last name, but they were all in the room, and we were talking about journalism, kind of what the Bear Witness is all about. And I got really interested, and so I decided to leave film and join newspaper kind of on a whim. And it's kind of weird because the first few weeks of journalism, I got so nervous, and I kind of just wanted to join marketing for a minute because I was like, I don't know if I can do this. And then I kind of learned more about it, and I made a lot of friends on the staff, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I also figured out I just really, really love writing because I was getting a lot better at writing that year. So I kind of figured out that it's just really what I want to do, and I really enjoyed it. And then this year I ran for the position for editor, and I realized I like editing papers even more. So it's just kind of cool learning about journalism and stuff.
Yeah, it definitely was scary at first, especially for me, because one, I was the only freshman in the class, and it was just so new and so different. I didn't really know what I was getting into, but yeah.
Okay, so now let's move on to like a larger discussion of what are the implications of journalism in today's society, and what are your thoughts on that? Like, with all this fake news happening, with all this mass information, with a bunch of misinformation, there's a lot of misrepresentation in there as well. Mm-hmm. What are your guys' thoughts on this?
I personally believe that a lot of people kind of have this perspective of journalism that's really, really skewed now, where a lot of people see almost any news source as maybe not so trustworthy anymore, and people really feel the need to just maybe go immediately to almost a university source or the CDC for all the information, especially like recent news. But there's a lot of news sources that you can trust. I think it just depends on what you're looking for. So when it comes to political news, you obviously probably shouldn't necessarily go to Fox or CNN, not because they're not good news sources, but because they are very politically opinion based, and they do often have articles that are mainly based off of opinions of the actual news source and stuff like that. But I do think that journalism kind of has gotten a really bad rep in the past decade or so, especially because history shows that yellow journalism and stuff like that has become very known in American history as kind of journalists perceiving certain stories and certain angles really, really wrongly in order to get audience attention. And I don't think that's the right way to perceive journalism. It is meant to inform the public on the truth and what's going on as bluntly as possible. And I think what we've learned in class has definitely taught us that no matter what, even if you think your story is going to be the most bland thing ever, it needs to be based on facts. So it really stinks that people see journalism as just so wrong now, because it isn't in most cases.
You can't be biased.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
whatever your opinion is or whatever, you have to like just speak the truth and use the information that's given to you and not twist it.
So you guys believe that you have to always say the truth, which is obviously like makes sense. And you believe that journalism isn't as bad as it's portrayed because people have like started slandering it. Now, do you think so then obviously you guys would agree that this, when the capitalism comes in and people are like paid for it and they get more paid for a better article, do you think that's the reason why people will start adding lies or misinformation in their articles?
I think it has to do with a lot of different outside factors, capitalism and just wanting to gain more profit being one. I think a lot of times, you search on Google and the first thing that pops up is an advertisement for the product you might need. That might not be the best product, but people pay their way to be at the top of that page. You know what I'm saying? So it kind of goes into aspects with money, as well as a lot of times people just don't want to accept the truth, so they're just going to put their opinion out there rather than facts. And that's often what happens with not specific news sources, but in general. And honestly, that's kind of what opinion columns are for. So I personally really dislike seeing some news sources kind of interjecting opinions in something that's supposed to be purely facts, because that's not what it's there for. It's there to inform you bluntly. So honestly,
you see your news, you probably look at it with some like disdain, and you're like, I don't really think this is true. So where do you go for your news? Where do you guys use the same mainstream like Fox, CNN, or do you guys say, no, I'm going to go to a more lesser known, more honest?
I'd say for me, I probably get my news like New York Times and Washington Post. Like I'm not like a super news junkie where I'm like just absorbed in it all the time, but those are probably like the two main platforms that I'll get my news on. Yeah, I kind of go to a various amount of sources, just because it kind of depends on what kind of depth you want on each story. So when it kind of comes to state and like Atlanta news, I look at the AJC because that's probably going to be the most relevant thing to me. And then when I'm just looking for national or politics stuff, I usually look at New York Times or Washington Post, like Rachel said. Often I do look for health stories, like currently with Corona and sometimes the flu season and cold season. I always just look to the CDC because that's always the most reliable thing for health related and medical stuff like that. So I always just refer to that. But when it comes to anything, I really just look at New York Times or AJC.
So what advice do you have to give out to people who are falling for these like fallacies about like with all this misinformation happening? What advice do you guys have to give to them?
Probably just fact check and look at other sources.
Yeah, definitely cross-source your everything, because It's not a good idea just to look at the same news source for everything, because personally, my parents are very much more conservative, and I'm much more moderate or liberal than them. So when they go to their news, they often look at Fox. So they often get their opinions and just their news from Fox. Not saying it's completely unreliable, but you should always be looking at multiple news sources in order to get the big picture rather than just maybe one perspective. So I would always suggest to avoid fallacies, just to look at the news first and then maybe see other people's opinions. So maybe look at the straight facts of the situation rather than going to maybe a broadcast source.
Okay, so that's on like the reader's end. Now, society has turned to a point where misinformation sells, right? And the implications are huge. In India, there was actually a case where there was actually a lynching based off of misinformation. And in response to that, WhatsApp, the texting app, social media app, they said you can only forward your messages to 10 people max. Because what people were doing is they would say, oh, this guy right here, he's evil. They would forward it to like 50 people, and now the entire community got together to kill the dude. So that was a true case that happened in India. So, and WhatsApp took a step against it and said, we're going to limit how many numbers you can forward it to. What other steps do you guys think people could take, not people, but like the corporations, to keep journalism honest and not as harmful as it sometimes can get?
I think in order to, do you mean like from a reader's perspective or
from the publisher's perspective?
Oh, okay. I think it's definitely difficult to do that because people who are reading news definitely will perceive it any way you want to, because often people don't really want to change their opinions no matter how true the information is or how in-depth the information is. So I think it always comes down to making the information the most reliable information you can find. So always checking your sources, always researching as much as possible, always having an editor read through it multiple times before you publish that. Like that's especially what we do at the Bear Witness. We have at least 3 people go through papers before we publish them, just because we want to make sure there's no grammar issues, there's no information that we need to see more of, as well as just maybe issues with just grammar or how it's something spelled. Honestly, just kind of everything you need to read through is from a publisher's aspect in order to get the most reliable information to the public.
All right.
But, yeah.
What about you, Rachel?
Honestly, I agree with her. I don't have anything to add. But yeah, with like the editors thing, I just have to brag about Brooke for a second because she is so good at like editing papers and like looking for that kind of stuff. Like when we sit down together and we're like reading an article, she'll point out like things that I didn't even notice. Like you need to add that detail here, or you need to expand this, or you need to reword this because like it's not going to be clear to the reader or whatever. And like hopefully if I'm an editor next year, I want to like absorb those qualities that she has and stuff. And she also, she gives me like so much tough love too, which I also want to like mimic. She's like, Rachel, I know you can do better than this.
But yeah, to flatter Rachel for a second, she has to be one of probably the best reporter on our team. I have seen this girl pump out stories within like an hour. It's crazy. And she's just so talented. And that's kind of something that every editor or publisher should do, is always looking for the best qualities in a reporter and just getting as much as you can out of that. There's some people on our team who take a little bit longer on stories, but they're fantastic writers. And I know they have so much in them that they could maybe cut down the deadline a little bit and they could get a just as good story out. And I think it just comes down to, when it comes to publishing the best story, it comes down to the timeliness as well as the quality of the story. So
I now want to shift from journalism to just writing. Do you guys write personally for yourself? Or do you journal for yourself?
Sometimes I have, like, school is so busy and I don't really have time to like write for myself as I used to, but definitely when I was younger and I had time, I would like type these horribly written poems onto like the computer. They were so bad, but I would just like roll them out with just trucking it. And sometimes I wrote like narratives for myself on my computer, or like it had gotten to the point where I started writing songs. Absolutely terrible. I don't know why I still have that journal with awful things, but yeah, I've like personally just kind of like hit different genres of writing and stuff.
Yeah, I actually have. It's so weird that you say that because the other day I just was talking to a friend about poems and I opened up this folder I haven't opened since January of last year. And they're not great. They're definitely not great, but they're there. So I guess you could say I do read out of school. But then I also have on my Google Docs, I have it on my personal email. I have a lot of like short story ideas that I sometimes try to build on. And since probably freshman year, I've kind of wanted to write a novel, but as a high school student, that's extremely difficult just because there's so much time that goes into that. Those take years. So I've always kind of found an idea and just tried to build at least a short story off of it. So maybe I can expand on it. So I do like writing outside of school. It's just not my main hobby, I guess.
So while I was preparing for this episode, I was researching on writing and journalism. And apparently when you're sitting in a class and you listen to your teacher, that's one way of learning, right? The next step, which is better for learning, is you actually say it out loud. You tell it to somebody else. And a step after that is writing it out. If you write something, your understanding of it is much better than just listening to it or telling somebody else. Now, on top of that, there are a bunch of people who want to start writing. I know a bunch of my friends who are like, yeah, I want to write a storybook. I actually want to write this short essay. What advice do you have for them to help them motivate them to start? Or if they're stuck in a writer's block, let's say, what advice do you have for that at that point?
You definitely need to find your style in writing, to write in general, because personally, I used a lot of adjectives before I started writing for the Bear Witness, and then I started writing for them, and everybody who would edit my papers would be like, why is there 15 adjectives in front of one word? That's not needed. So I think it's a lot of people reading your work, even if you're scared of it, as well as just kind of finding the way you want to write. Rachel has a very, very good voice. She kind of just is very blunt when she writes, and you can tell that she wrote it because she's very, it's not necessarily informal, but it's definitely, you can tell it's Rachel because she balances out kind of bigger, more complex words with kind of having her own style and taste of words in there. So I think it kind of goes down to your own diction as well as how you form sentences and just kind of what you're trying to write. But I don't know. I mean, Rachel might have a different perspective on it.
Yeah, I agree. But yeah, whenever I start writing something, I just either the first thing that I do is just make an outline and bullet points, and then just kind of work from that.
So you'd say outlines are good for
Totally.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so the next question I have for you is, do you guys read? Are you guys big readers or?
Yeah, I like to read. I just don't really have a lot of time to because of school.
And so with that being said, has that improved your writing?
Definitely. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. You see a lot of different forms of writing when you read books and just kind of how people want to portray things and how people put detail into certain parts of a story, I guess you could say.
And reading has expanded my vocabulary and what words I use, and definitely my voice in writing too.
All right. So with that being said, the next thing I want to move on to is the information overflow. So we talked about misinformation. We talked about how the ethics of this all, the capitalistic gains of it all. Now I want to talk about how there's so much content just being pushed out in the writing sphere with news articles. So I have the notifications on for Washington Post, New York Times, and this other, I think The Economist. But every time a certain event happens, within minutes, it may not even be that big, but I get notifications within minutes. And throughout the day, I'm getting 50, 60 articles saying oh, read this, read this, read this. What are your thoughts on this information overload being pushed out to the public about content of journalisms and newspaper and these organizations? Is it a bad thing? Is it a good? Do you think that it's successful for journalists that we've reached a stage where we can now push out so much content, or is it that no, we're going to overburden the public?
I think it kind of varies because on one hand, it is good to have a lot of different aspects of a story as well as just information that might be helpful to you and your perspective, because with certain recent events, you might want to have every perspective possible in order to find out what are the most important, most impactful things of the virus that's going around. So there might be one story on how it affects the elderly, as well as one story about how it affects infants, and then one story how it affects a healthy population, et cetera. So it helps to have a lot of information on a big topic, but it doesn't help when it might be very, very repetitive and not as informative as you need it to be, I guess you could say. So I think it kind of just depends on the news source as well as what kind of stories are being pushed out. But it kind of varies. I think it's kind of a difficult topic to grasp because personally our publishment doesn't really push out multiple stories in a day because we are a student-led paper, so it's very difficult for a lot of kids to push out a story in 2 days because they might be busy.
A few of us.
Yeah, that too. So it's kind of different. It just depends on the publishment, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So if before we wrap this up, if you had like a sales pitch of a sort, if you wanted people to help to start journaling or start writing, what would you say?
It's going to help you on every level of creativity, no matter what it is, in my opinion. I think I have a lot more confidence in my writing and confidence in general since I've started writing so frequently. I have just confidence in general when I go to school because I feel it's not necessarily that I feel smarter, but I just definitely feel that I have more credibility in my writing because I do it for not only a hobby now, but I do it as I have a leadership role in a class that's all writing based. So it's kind of interesting to see how that changes your personality as well as just your writing style. And it also kind of just gives you more insight on how writing should be perceived and how you might want to do writing later on in life and different careers in writing. So
yeah, I absolutely agree. Journalism has like totally changed me. It's crazy. My writing is like, I've grown so much and improved so much, and I know there's like still so much that I can learn and stuff. Like I'm going to a journalism camp over the summer, and I'm so excited to like further my writing skills. And also, like Brooke said, changing my personality. In middle school and like in elementary school, I was so timid and very reserved, and journalism has like definitely forced me, but in a good way, to become a more social person. And I've gained a lot of good communication skills through my interviews. I've learned how to make small talk, which I've never been good at before. And like I've gained a lot of acquaintances, and like some people I've interviewed now we're like really close friends.
Really?
That's cool.
That's awesome. So with that, in this episode, we talked about misinformation, misrepresentation, and we talked about the capitalism and how that's all affecting journalism. We talked about the mass information being given to the public. We talked about Rachel and Brooke as journalists, how it affected them, how some advice for if you wanted to start writing. And with that, thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's our show. Thank you so much for listening. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel. We'll be back every Tuesday with more content to keep you going on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Thanks again, and always remember to live unscripted.